Okay, so next let's look into the manifest workflow. So we'll do a quick recap to start out. Now for those of you that forgot, the manifest workflow involves using an external DMS. So in this case, we're going to take the example of Azure Blob Storage. That's where we're going to host our files. And then we're going to use pre-authenticated URLs to actually access these files so we can provide them to the Synchronization API. From there, we write the contents of these files into an empty iModel. So to start out, we do need an iModel, an empty iModel to work with. So I have one right here. I create another one called yet another empty iModel to continue our trend of empty iModels that are no longer empty. And what files are we going to be synchronizing into this iModel? So I have my blob container right here. Here are the two files, the same files that we saw, but they're in Azure Blob Storage in this case. And from here, we can start consuming them in the Synchronization API directly. Now, before we can do that and actually go into the synchronization process, as always, we first do need a way to identify these files. So how do we actually identify the files in the DMS, and how would that work? So this depends on the DMS we're using. Some DMSs might already have unique IDs for their files, and some might not. In the case of Azure, Azure does not have unique IDs, so we're going to have to think of some way to uniquely identify these files. One of the ways we can do that is by using the URL for the file. So here's an example URL. I'm going to copy that, just show you what it looks like. So here's the actual structure of it. We have the name of the blob storage, then we have the name of the container, and then we have the name of the file. So that's what we're going to use for our unique IDs in this case. Okay, so now that we have a way to identify the files, we can actually go into the Synchronization API. So we're going to go through the three-step process again of first actually creating a connection, then running the connection, and then waiting and polling for the status of the synchronization to see if it's complete. So let's go through these steps in the manifest workflow. So we'll start out with creating a manifest connection. So let's click try it out, pass in an authorization code, and then we need to give it a display name. So this time I'm going to give a more meaningful display name. Let's call it building models. We need the iModel ID. I can get that from the My iModels page. So I'll just copy it from here. Authentication type is going to be user because we're using a client workflow in this case. And for the source file IDs, we're going to use the URL for the file. So here's my first file. I'll copy the URL, paste it here, and I'll do the same for the other file as well. Okay, so I have my file IDs set up, and we can go ahead and click execute. So that creates our manifest connection, and I will copy this connection ID and store it for later. Okay, so from here we can go ahead and actually run this connection. So we go to create manifest connection, run, click try it out, pass in an authorization code, pass in my connection ID, scroll down, and this is where it's a little bit more complicated in the manifest approach of how we actually define a run. So we need the file ID here that we just defined, the URLs. So I'll just paste one here as an example. Now this is key. We do want to make sure that we are writing the appropriate file with the appropriate ID. Now if you remember, synchronization is supposed to be a recurring process in which we keep synchronizing the files as we update them on the source side. So we need a way to identify what data is coming from which file. And that's where the unique IDs come in. If, for example, we don't use the right unique ID with the right file, in this case, then we can end up with duplicate data in the model, or we can just totally screw up our iModel. So it's very important that we keep track of these IDs. Okay, so next up, we need the name for the file. I can copy that as well. Action is going to be bridge. So this is another thing you can modify. An action is what exactly are we doing with the file. Bridge is the default, which means we're synchronizing the data of this file into the iModel, but you can also have the action of unmap, where you desynchronize the data. You're removing data for that file in an iModel. So as we talked about, synchronization is a recurring process, so you might at a later stage decide that you don't want the data for this file in that model. So you can do that by defining the action as unmap in this case. Then we have the URL. Now this is going to be the pre-authenticated URL, not to be confused by the URL we're using here as the unique ID. So how do we get the pre-authenticated URL? In the case of Azure, the way we do that is we go back to our files, right-click, click Generate SaaS, scroll down, Generate SaaS token and URL, and this is our SaaS URL. You can copy that and then paste it over here. Then we need the connector type. For this, it's just Revit. In case you don't know where I got that from, it's from the supported format section in the API. And children, so this is for any references. In this case, we don't have any reference files. This is mostly for DGN or DWGs or any other file format where you have multiple files for one model. Okay, so in this way, I'm going to fill out the details for the other file as well. All right, so all of my details for the run have been filled out, and I can hit execute. And this gives me back my run ID. So the way we can get that is this is the URL of the run, and here are our runs, and this is the ID tagged on at the end of the URL. So let me copy this, and we can move on to the last step of getting our run status. So we'll do get manifest connection run, click try it out, pass an authorization code, paste the run ID here, and have my connection ID stored, so I can copy that, paste, hit execute. And you can see that right now the job is waiting to execute, so it's in the queue. So let's hit execute again. So it's still waiting, so I'm going to give it a couple minutes and come back. All right, so you can see that our synchronization was successful. You can see individual file statuses, and then you can also see the overall status of the run. And that's how the manifest workflow works. We go all the way from creating our connection to running it and getting our run status until it completes. At this point, you have enough information to actually start integrating this workflow within applications. So we're going to look at some code samples in the next chapter and get you started with building your own custom synchronization solution.